Welcome. My name is Anderson Cook, coordinator for Read SC, the South Carolina Center for the Book. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I want to make sure all attendees know that we do have closed captions available. There should be a CC icon at the bottom of your screen for closed captions if you want to follow along with the transcript for any reason. The format for tonight's talk will be a brief introduction, and then our speaker for the evening, Rebecca Bruff, will talk about her book, Trouble the Water. After the talk, we should have time for a few questions. So if you think of any, there is a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Click that button. The chat box will pop up on the right side of your screen for you to type any questions that you may have. And feel free to enter questions at any point during the talk, and I will read them at the end. Now, a little about our speaker tonight. Rebecca Dwight Bruff earned her bachelor's degree in education from Texas A&M and master and doctorate degrees in theology from Southern Methodist University. In 2017, she was a scholarship recipient for the prestigious Key West Literary Seminar. She volunteers at the Pat Connery Literary Center in Beaufort, plays tennis, enjoys travel, and loves life in the Low Country. I know that I would if I lived there. Now, however, I want to go ahead and give her the stage. I hope you will join me in welcoming Rebecca Bruff.
Thanks, Anderson, and thank you to the South Carolina State Library for this series that you host and for the opportunity to be with you. And sorry about the chiming in the background. That's part of what we get when we Zoom, right? I guess it's time, right? So I thought what I would do this evening, if it's all right with you all, is give you a little bit of the background of my discovery of the story of Robert Smalls and my journey into the way this particular version of that story, this historical fiction, came to be. So I'll share some of that, some of the things that I learned along the way, and I'll try to keep that brief enough that we have time for some questions and some conversation. I don't know if there's a way, maybe we can use the chat box if our participants have read the book. It's helpful for me to know that, or if they've not. So if those of you who are on want to indicate that, if you've not read the book, I don't want to spoil, and if you have, it may take our conversation a different direction. So we'll see what we discover here. So as Anderson said, I am originally from Texas. I live in South Carolina now, but I've been a Texan most of my life, and was living in Dallas in 2013 when my husband and I visited North Carolina and then South Carolina. We're a merger family, have 5 grown children. And in 2013, the youngest was graduating from UNC at Chapel Hill, which was where my husband did his grad school. So he was very happy to have another excuse to go to Chapel Hill. So we visited Chapel Hill and celebrated graduation. And then we had a couple of extra days. So we slid down the coast to the Low Country. And I'd never been in South Carolina, and I'd never been in the Low Country, of course. And having grown up in Texas and actually in West Texas as a child, where it's flat and dry and brown, I was thoroughly enchanted with the water and the trees and the green and the birds and the beauty of the Low Country. We weren't there very long. We just had a couple of days, and I'm going to share with you, if I can get my screen share doing what I think it can do. Let's see here. There we go. I hope you all can see that. So as you know, it looks like our participants are from that region. So Beaufort is just about halfway between Charleston and Savannah on the South Carolina coast. As I said, I'd never seen that. I'd never been to any of the Low Country, so I was just enchanted with the entire geography. But well, now I can't make this forward. There we go. We jumped on a carriage tour so that we could kind of get the lay of the land a little bit. And as you know, in these historic places, the tours have a, I guess I would say, sort of a sliding scale of accuracy of information, but they're really entertaining. And I've been on a number of these tours since then. So the variation on the stories, you know, there's not 100% consistency, but in general, the story's consistent. And on this tour, what we learned after we had a couple of minutes to go around a few blocks is that, you know, Beaufort's one of the oldest towns in South Carolina. It sits at the Port Royal Sound, and it's a beautiful little town that was really spared a lot of the ravages of the American Civil War because Lincoln sent that giant armada to Port Royal Sound early in the war. And the locals and the Confederates that were not quite ready for all that evacuated. They evacuated the homes and all the buildings. In Beaufort, it's called the Great Skedaddle. And the federal troops occupied the homes and used the large homes and the churches for hospitals and such. So we learned a little bit of that and kind of learned the layers of history. They go way previous to the Civil War, and oh my gosh, it's layers and layers and layers of fascinating history. We stopped in front of the Tabernacle Baptist Church in downtown Beaufort and saw this bust of this man, and the carriage driver told us his name was Robert Smalls and pointed to a plaque that sits here. The Tabernacle Baptist Church is a old church that was built by and for enslaved people in the early 1800s, and it's still functioning. It's a very active congregation now, a really important part of the community. But this bust of Smalls sits there, and it commemorates his heroism and his courage and his leadership, and he is actually buried in this courtyard along with the members of his family. And on the tour, the carriage driver pointed out the plaque, which tells us that he was born here in Beaufort in 1839, and actually just a few blocks from where this church and this bust are. That he was born enslaved. His mother's name was Lydia Polite, and that in the war, when he was working on a cotton steamer that became a Confederate gunboat, he managed to commandeer that boat in the dark of night in May of 1862. And he liberated himself along with his crewmates and his wife and children and some of the others. And so, you know, that alone is that's a standalone fabulous story. They knew when they attempted that escape that it was absolutely do or die. They would survive, or they would literally end up on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. We went a little bit further and we saw this beautiful home in the historic neighborhood of Beaufort. This is now known as the Mckees Smalls House. It was built by John Mckee, who passed away just before Smalls was born, and his son Henry Mckee and Henry's wife Jane lived in this house. And Smalls' mother, Lydia Polite, was a house slave here, and she gave birth to Smalls behind this house one night alone. He was born in April of 1839. She was 45 years old when she gave birth to him, which I think is another story in itself. The fact that that she had that kind of just sheer strength. We know the historical record shows that she had another child some time before Smalls' birth, and some of the sources tell us his name is Larry or Lawrence Polite. Not much in the record about him. But this is where Smalls was born. The Mckees hired him out. That was the language used at the time. Sent him to Charleston, where he worked. Enslaved labor in Charleston, of course, made Charleston wealthy and beautiful. So he worked there. His wages went back to Mr. Mckee, And he worked as a lamplighter. He worked in restaurants. He had various jobs. He worked at the Planter Inn. We'll talk about that again in a moment. But he loved the water. And at some point, we don't know exactly how it was arranged, but he was able to work on a cotton steamer. And cotton was king in all kinds of ways. Cotton was worth more than gold at that time and was being shipped all over the world. So he was working on a cotton steamer. He was the helmsman of that steamer eventually, which really made him the pilot, but the nomenclature of pilot wasn't used for enslaved people. But he was piloting the boat. He knew all the routes and the waterways and the channels. When the war began in Charleston, right there at Fort Sumter, these cotton steamers were all leased by the Confederate Navy, and they became gunboats and troop runners and that sort of thing. So the boat that Smalls was working on, which was called the Planter, became a Confederate gunboat. There he is at that age, a handsome young man. He was about 21 in this picture. This is the cotton steamer that was turned into the gunboat. This is the Planter. So at this point, you got to kind of let this sink in. He was enslaved on a boat that was keeping him enslaved. And they were delivering ammunitions and guns to all those forts around Charleston Harbor. There were at any given time 5 or 6 or 7 of those. He knew all the channels. He knew all the signals. He was very observant, and he had, according to the original sources and part of his own story, he had really carefully observed the captain, the Confederate captain of that boat. And one of his crewmates at one point made note that if it were dark enough and if he imitated the captain's gait, that he could actually be mistaken for the captain. They were of the same stature, about the same size, and that kind of planted a seed for him. There's a picture of the boat again. So on that night, on May 13th in 1862, the Confederate officers, Captain Relier and the others, left the boat against orders, and they went into Charleston to do whatever young officers do in Charleston when they've left the boat against orders. I guess they were celebrating something. And after dark, Robert Smalls and his crewmates started the engine, and they moved very slowly and quietly from the South Wharf. For those who are familiar with Charleston, that is right there on the Battery, and there's actually a plaque to Robert Smalls about this story at that site, which is the site of the Historic Charleston Foundation building now. So they went there. They very quietly moved up to the North Wharf and picked up the women and the children that were waiting for them. And then they began making their way out of Charleston Harbor. And so if you can see okay from this map, it doesn't show the exact route of their travel, but they had to pass Castle Pinckney, which was a fortress. I don't know why it's called a castle instead of a fort, but it was fortified with guns that he had taken there. And then Fort Ripley, and then Fort Johnson, and then Fort Moultrie. And Sumter, of course, was the most heavily armed of those, and he had to get past that. And so he called all the signals for all of those forts. And they finally, after several slow and probably agonizing hours, they made it out to the Union blockade in the Atlantic Ocean. And they got there just about the time the sun was coming up, and had to pull down the stars and bars, the Confederate flag and the South Carolina flag. And the story goes that Small's wife had remembered to grab a white bed sheet to hoist as a flag of surrender. And it was really just in time because of course the federal troops on the Union boats were, they were turning their cannons to this Confederate gunboat. So they were managed to surrender surrender the boat, and they were all liberated. We'll come back to the title in just a minute. It's a picture of Smalls as an older gentleman. What we know, regarding the story of the escape is that he did surrender that boat to the I'm going to step out of the screen share here so that I can talk to you all. He did surrender the boat to the Union Navy. He was actually placed in charge of that boat almost immediately. He didn't qualify to be a naval officer because he was illiterate, but he did qualify to be an Army officer. So he was immediately consigned to the Army for the Union, and then detailed to the Navy to run that boat for the rest of the war. Some of you who are familiar with Small's story probably know Kate Linesbury's book called Be Free or Die, and it really details his service on that boat through the rest of the war. When the war was over, he'd been well paid, for one thing. He had a nice reward from surrendering the boat, and he was paid as an officer. And he had an opportunity to go north. He did a lot of speaking in the North for the abolitionist cause. He was quite a celebrity, actually, and really seen as a hero. And he could have stayed in the North, probably for good. And I can't imagine that didn't cross his mind. But he was committed to his community. And so he went back to Beaufort, and he went to the tax office, and all the homes that had been evacuated by those planters and their families during the occupation were available for back taxes. So he bought that beautiful home that he was born behind, and he lived in it the rest of his life, and he raised his family there. And he actually died on that front porch. And in fact, the date of his death, the anniversary of his death was this week. It was February 23rd in 1915. So he died literally yards from where he was born on that property. But in the intervening years, he was a community leader. He was elected to local legislature, and then to Congress. He represented South Carolina in the U.S. Congress 5 terms. He was an extraordinary champion of literacy, and actually authored some of the first legislation that guaranteed literacy for the children of South Carolina, made access to education available for all children. After having been denied that as a child, it was against the law to teach an enslaved person to read or to write. So he had the opportunity to change that, not only for himself, but for generations after. He had some businesses. He was a property owner, just a successful businessman, a political leader, founded the Republican Party of South Carolina, was one of the founders of that, which was, of course, a very different political landscape at the time, but he was part of that. And he was instrumental, quite instrumental, in bringing what is now Paris Island and the Marine Depot there, acquiring that land. So he was just an extraordinary leader, and really kept kind of a steady style of leadership. One of the things I learned in the writing of the book was that, after the war and after the dismantling of Reconstruction, which didn't last awfully long and was going awfully well, but then the wheels really came off for a lot of reasons. There was probably always a bounty on him. He was such a great leader, an African-American leader, and there were people that did not want his power to be part of the equation at all. So he was always in danger, but he never carried a gun. He never carried a sidearm, which I just think is extraordinary. He was comfortable with the big cannons on the boats, but not with guns. But even so, he managed to be a peacekeeper and a peacemaker whenever he could. When things got bad, he really believed in the power of education and the power of leadership with integrity to to keep the peace and to move forward. So his contributions, his legacy are just extraordinary. And back to my carriage tour, I learned a lot of, not all of that, but a lot of that on that carriage tour. But the day that I first heard his name on that tour, I'd never heard it before. I was kind of shocked when I heard parts of the story about what he'd done and how bravely he'd done that. It was really hard for me to imagine that he wasn't in our history books. Just knowing the little bit that I learned that day, I thought, well, he's like George Washington. He's like Frederick Douglass. We should know his name. Why don't we know his name? So I got off the carriage. I went straight to the bookstore right across the street from where the carriage tour finished. And I asked for the books about Robert Smalls. And I learned that there were, that day in the bookstore, there were only 3. There was a pretty good biography that had been written in the mid-1990s. There was a beautifully illustrated children's book. And there was a book about his legislative life called Gullah Statesman. And that's all I could find. And I thought, well, that's odd. He was born here. He was a hero here. Surely there's more about this man. So I bought those books. I carried them back home to Dallas a few days later and began reading. And as I read, I learned a lot, but I also had a lot of questions. And there was a point at which I thought I'm learning things about this man, but my list of questions is longer than my list of details about him. As I read those books, I realized that there are unanswered questions, all kinds of questions. Where did his last name come from? That was one of my very first questions. His mother's name was Polite. The family that enslaved him and his mother were named Mckees, but his last name was Smalls. So what was that about? And of course, that led to who was his father. And there are speculations, but those rabbit trails ran out. He did learn to read and write. We know that he had a tutor later in life, but what was the rest of that story? What were his relationships like with the Mckees family and their daughter, who was the very same age, growing up together? What was that like? Just a million questions. My background's in education and theology, and I'm always curious about what motivates people and what their interior life is like. And so I wondered, what were his hopes? What were his dreams? What made him happy? What made him angry? What gave him that courage that he had, and that grounding, and that sense of capability that was just a part of who he was throughout his life. So after a couple of years of reading and doing some research and looking things up online, I still hadn't really found the story that I was looking for. Like I wanted to know about the person. I think so much history, and sometimes the way history is taught is we have some dates and some places and some names and some battles and that sort of thing. But that doesn't always tell us what the influences were. What were the faith influences in his life? What were the economic influences? What were the geographic influences? We know some of that because of just where the story happens. But I kind of went from curiosity to inquiry to obsession. and then I was really just sort of consumed with the man's story and with the unanswered questions. And somewhere along the way, someone said, they say that if you can't find the book that you want to read, you should write it. So I thought, well, I've always really loved reading, and I kind of dabbled, but not deeply, with writing. I never considered fiction or historical fiction or creative writing. Um, but that intrigued me. And I knew that I knew that there was a story. There was a story arc. We know when it starts and when it finishes and all the things that happen in between. I knew what my questions were. And so one day I thought really hard about that and wondered how you write a story. And so I Googled, how do you write a book? Which is kind of an embarrassing confession. On the other hand, if you want to learn how to do something, there are resources out there of all kinds. And, I knew that I was well read enough and had some capacity for trying to put a story together. But I knew also that I had a lot to learn about how to do that. And so I found online tutorials and books about the craft of writing and workshops and all kinds of good things, and started kind of messing around with that a little bit. We were still in Dallas. And in the early fall of 2016, I sort of had this moment of thinking, I really want to write this book, and that is going to require pretty full attention. And I really love this job that I have, and that requires full attention. And I need to kind of figure out what I'm going to do about that. And my husband and I had a conversation and kind of came to the conclusion that, there's no time like the present to try something ridiculously impossible and crazy. And so I spoke with my supervisor, and we arranged for me to go to Beaufort in early 2017, which at the time was going to be a 4-month sabbatical, and research and write the book. Um, Early in 2017 was when the Pat Conroy Literary Center opened in Beaufort, which was just an incredible gift to me. They were offering some wonderful workshops, and I was able to sort of enter into a really supportive community early on, and meet some people that were kind of cheerleaders, but they also gave me some real guidance in terms of resources and direction. And in fact, that's how I met the person who became my agent. I just was beyond fortunate to be introduced to one of the world's best literary agents, which never happens, but it happened. And she was already familiar with the story of Smalls and had been looking for someone to tell that story. So she was a champion of the book. And there were lots of others along the way. So after a couple of months, I realized that I couldn't write a book in 2 months or 4 months or 6 months or 8 months, but that I probably could write the book. And in that time, we also discovered that we really loved the Low Country and could see us making that our permanent home, which we did, and we're really glad, and we love it. So now I kind of have 2 homes. You know what? I think I'm going to just stop right there for a minute and see if any of our participants have questions or commentary. I recognize one name who I know has read the book, but I don't know if the others have. So I don't want to give too much away, but I do want an opportunity for people to ask their questions or share their observations. So I'll just stop for a minute. Or you may have a question, Anderson. I don't know.
I don't know if you want to say, I already have several questions, but I don't know if they would be best saved for the end or if you want me to ask 1 or 2 of them now.
Yep. Dive in with something. Let's see where it takes us.
Sure. As someone who works at a library, of course, one of my first questions is going to be, where did you find the majority of the resources that you used for this book?
Thank God for libraries and librarians. I mean, seriously, I don't know what we would do without libraries, anyone who tries to research anything. But the Beaufort Library has what is called the Beaufort Collection, which is this fabulous historical collection, the upstairs part of the main library. And I spent a lot of time there. So I certainly found resources there. There's some original things. There are these massive histories. Dr. Lawrence Rowland, who's a professor retired from University of South Carolina, has a giant 3-volume history of South Carolina. And it's just unbelievable. It's an encyclopedia of the history of South Carolina. But there's lots of stuff like that. So that was crazy helpful. I spent a ton of time there and asked a lot of questions. So that was part of the research. I also found, not in the library, actually before I moved away from Dallas, one of the most critical volumes that I found was in a used bookstore. There's a chain out here called Half Price Books, and they, you have to dig around a little bit, but they have these great old books. And I was there one day on my lunch hour, just poking around in the history section, and found a book called A House Divided. And I don't recall the editor's names right now, but it's a huge anthology, a collection of essays and sermons and articles, original source material. They were all written in the lead up to the Civil War. And half of the book is a collection of all those things in support of slavery. So sermons supporting slavery based on scripture, articles, economics, what was considered social science at the time, religious things, essays, all sorts of things, pro-slavery. And the other half of the book are all those same things, anti-slavery. The sermons based on the same scripture, but from another perspective, the economic arguments, all of that. And it was fascinating because it was like being in the conversation in the time. It really opened my eyes to the breadth and depth of those conversations. So documents like that were great. And then of course there were, the things that we're all more familiar with, the Two Roads to Gettysburg, some of the great sort of current history pieces that added so much. So the reading was really important, and the inquiry that way was really important. But alongside that, some of the research was walking around Beaufort and walking around Charleston and getting the sense of place. Again, I'm from Texas, and we don't have coastlines and tides and palmetto trees. And, I needed to feel and see and smell and experience the place, both places. Love being in Charleston. I was really, I was just curious about some of the logistics of Small's life there. I kind of had a sense of where he might have lived at the time. And we knew that for a while he was working at the restaurant at the Planter Hotel. Like, what was his route? Where was the Planter Hotel then? It's not where it is now. What did it sound like when the church bells at that corner on Meeting Street would ring? What was the skyline like? What was that city like? There's a wonderful bookstore there that hosts walking tours, and there's one in particular that's sort of the untold Black stories of Charleston. And you probably know Damon Fordham, and he leads a great tour and stops and tells the stories that haven't always been told. So that was part of the research. I don't know if I would call it research exactly, but I had the extraordinary opportunity to meet Small's great-great-grandson, who's in Charleston. And the first time I heard him speak, he was at the Penn Center on St. Helena, outside of Beaufort, talking about Smalls. They had a small exhibition, and he came to speak. And I'd only been in town for a few months, and I couldn't wait to hear him speak. I was, so excited. And when I walked in, he was greeting people as they came in, and he thanked me for coming, and I thanked him for being there and speaking. And I was too intimidated to tell him that I wanted to write a book about his great-great-grandfather. So I just said, Robert Smalls is my history crush. I just think he's amazing. And, and he said, me too. That's why I'm here. So, so listening to him was really wonderful. And it was also, it kind of corroborated some things. I had speculated that maybe Small's last name was because he wasn't very big, he wasn't very tall. And I remember Michael, the great-great-grandson, kind of saying the same thing that evening. And I thought, okay, that's, that makes sense. That's not a crazy idea. I can work with that. After the manuscript was ready for the publisher, my agent asked Michael to read it, and which was terrifying to me because, it's his family story. It's their story. It's public domain, but it's their story. And so I said to him, I don't want you to you don't have to fact check or proofread or anything. You don't have to read it if you don't want to. But if you do, what I really want to know is whether or not it honors the spirit and the character of your great-great-grandfather. And so we dropped it off with him and then didn't hear from him for the longest time. And I thought, either he tossed it or he hates it. But then he called and he said he had read it. And he invited me to come and have a conversation about it. And that was really wonderful. And it also added to the some detail to the book. He had, between the time he received the manuscript and when we had the conversation, he had taken a DNA test, and he had learned that his ancestors were from Ghana, from the Mende, from Sierra Leone, and from the Mende people. And I asked him if I could include those details in the book. I had known that it was very likely the West Africa, Ghana area, but he was able to confirm Sierra Leone. So that kind of thing was really valuable. One of the things I realized early on is that I could research forever and ever. Every trail leads to 9 more, and it could have gone on and on. But I discovered and determined pretty early that I would be doing historical fiction and not a biography. So I kind of began to learn when to cut off the historical research and go into the the relational and emotional side of the story. But I guess the one other thing I would say about research in terms of how to do historical fiction was that I sort of taught myself a lot by reading the author's notes of good historical fiction writers. And I think the really good ones tell us a little bit about how they do it. They're honest about what is true to the historical narrative and what they've imagined and how they do that. And so I was able to learn quite a lot from reading those good people.
I was gonna say, would you like another question? Because I do have one more I could ask.
I'll be brave and see what you've got.
What is something that really surprised you in your research, or maybe a resource that you didn't expect that ended up in your lap?
Well, certainly that House Divided resource was just a godsend. And meeting Michael, of course, was. Oh gosh, so many things surprised me. I realized one of the things that surprised me and that that sort of grieves me is my awareness of how little most of us are taught our own history, American history. I would read things that were, stunning and important, about decisions and legislations and the history of slavery in the United States, and thought that never showed up. I mean, that never appeared in a textbook or a classroom, and that's distressing, and so that, it was the sort of thing that once the veil was kind of lifted, it was obvious, but it was hard to just acknowledge how how much is missing from our history. And then, of course, why it's missing. And that's even more distressing. Um, I had in the midst of the research, I had kind of this, I guess, sort of a flashback memory. I moved away from the town that I grew up in right before I started high school. But in my hometown, the high school that I would have gone to, um, they were called the Rebels. The team were called the Rebels. The fight song was Dixie, and the gym had an enormous Confederate flag in it. And this was in the 60s. And I had never questioned anything about that. It had never occurred to me that, you know, that actually is a flag of a, you know, enemy of the Union. And that there was a lot of pride. Like I kind of got sort of the Southern pride, the sense of place, cultural pride that is very Texas and very Southern, but the symbols and just the cultural stuff of that period of time I'd never given a lot of thought to that. And I'm kind of a critical thinker, and I've been in school a lot, and so that was kind of an eye opener, and it just made me realize how many of us made assumptions about, that's just the way things were and that sort of thing. And it is the way things were, but complacency about that is not a particularly good thing, or complicity. So, so that was an eye opener for me, for sure. After the book came out, so I learned a little bit about kind of what happened, Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and how some of that happened that way, and why our history is taught the way it is. But after the book came out, I had a presentation in Little Rock. It was in 2019, so it was in person, and it was a pretty good size of group of people around my age, give or take a little bit. And it was mostly Anglo, but there were some African Americans in the group. And I asked a question that I often ask, which is, how many of you knew the story of Robert Smalls before I began? And a woman raised her hand. She was African American. She raised her hand. And I said, "Oh, are you from the Low Country?" And she said, "No, I grew up here in Little Rock." And she said, "When I was in 7th grade, the schools were integrated. But before the schools were integrated, our teachers were teaching us our stories, the stories of Black Americans. After integration, we weren't hearing those stories anymore." And that was an eye opener for me, because I know in principle, that a dominant culture sort of controls the narrative, but I hadn't thought about how that plays out in a classroom and how it plays out in the lives of children. And so, a lot of gratitude for the hard work of integration, but there was some loss in the curriculum. And of course that was deliberate as well. So that was pretty eye-opening. So I guess one of the surprises for me is that it's taught me so much, and has given me a bit of either a platform or a soapbox for us to talk about some of those things. It's really important. I think it's absolutely critical that we understand our history well enough that it helps us understand our present and think about our future. So, great question. I kind of rattled on that, but I think it's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it.
Well, and I think that was a very well said response, very well articulated, because you're absolutely right. There are many stories that are not even not forgotten, but just not highlighted.
Right. Well, right. And, and I mean, there are lots and lots of stories, and of all kinds, and stories are generally either, if they're important stories, they're either amplified or they're silenced. And there's a reason, for better or for worse, that those things happen. But I think it's wonderful. It's time for those stories that have been silenced to emerge. And I think that stories like Robert Smalls and Harriet Tubman's and, so many others, the more they are brought to light, the more other ones will be brought to light. And we need to know those stories and celebrate them.
I fully agree. I just want to remind all of our attendees tonight that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Otherwise, I will just keep asking questions. So another one that I would like to ask is, how do you feel like your perspective as a white woman shaped your approach to this story and potentially even reception to this story?
Well, that's just a giant, huge, important question, Anderson. From the very beginning, it was never lost on me that I'm how shall we say, a maturish white woman, privileged in this century, telling the story of an enslaved Black man from another time and another place. And so I knew that there were just these numerous big bridges, distances to cross, bridges to build. There's the distance, the race, gender, economics, privilege, geography, place in history, all those things that kind of had to be acknowledged and addressed, and some way to sort of build those bridges to cross those big gaps. I also early on sort of recognized I love reading in first person, and I like writing in first person. So the most natural thing when I began was writing small story in first person. So now I'm this person putting words in that person's mouth. And I recognize the challenge of that. I understand and really appreciate the issues of representation and appropriation, and wanted to be attentive to that because it matters a lot. And I also know that when we read stories and when we tell stories outside of our own experience, it's one of the ways we learn about the experiences of other people, and so and we see that in children, when they hear or learn a story about someone who is not them, or they see that played out in real life, it's what connects them to other people. It's what makes us care about other people. And so I felt like it kind of started with, who am I to tell this story, because of all those challenges. And then the more I got into the story and the more I got into the importance of building those bridges, it sort of shifted to, who am I to not tell this story? Like, how irresponsible would that be? Now that I have heard the story, I recognize the significance, and to say, well, that's somebody else's job. Someone else needs to tell that story. And so I, just kind of dove in. And I really called on my experiences out of ministry, hearing people's stories. I know that our stories are all very personal, but we experience a lot of universal emotions, and so most people do know what it's like to love and to lose and to dream and hope and be betrayed and all those things that are part of our lives. And I've heard a lot of those stories because of my work. And so I kind of dug into that and hoped that maybe I could translate some of those deep, basic human emotions into this person's story and the story of the people that were around him. So that was kind of how I tackled that. It was a challenge for some of the publishers that we talked to. My agent took it to lots of good folks, and some of them said, great story, great writing, but this is a white woman telling a Black man's story, and we're just not sure we want to risk that. And there is risk in that, and I understand that. And then, then she went to a small press who said, let's tell the story. So that's how it's happened. It's been I think particularly well received. I mean, I've been delighted at how well it's been received, um, regionally and beyond, and across races. So hopefully, that work of building the bridges has had some success. I pray that that's the case, and I really hope that it opens conversations, and I kind of see it doing that a little bit. So hopefully that will continue.
Well, I know that I definitely have more questions, and I'm sure that we could go on for much longer, but I think that that's a beautiful note to end on.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
thank you so much for
Listen,
sharing.
thanks so much for what you do with the library and for these author talks that you all are making available through our pandemic isolation. It's, we're all eager to be back in groups together in libraries, but you're doing something that helps us get through this time. So very grateful for that. Thanks, Anderson.
So if you are interested in learning more about Rebecca Bruff, and I certainly hope you are, please visit her website. I have shared it in the chat box. It is RebeccaBruff.com. And for information on more upcoming author talks posted by Read SC, the South Carolina Center for the Book, please visit readsc.org, also shared. As a reminder, if you don't have a copy of Trouble the Water yet, please purchase one from your local independent bookseller. I don't know if, Rebecca, you have one that you would like to recommend, but if so, please.
Well, of course, I'm a big fan of our local booksellers, but for folks who maybe don't have one in mind, there's a site called IndieBound, INDIE bound.com, that will tell you where your nearest local independent bookseller is. And we love supporting them.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that resource. I hope all of you are able to use it, and I hope you will all stay safe and be well. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Anderson. Good night. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you.